Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to another DocTalk series. Again, I really love doing these. I think it's just fun to kind of talk about something pertinent to health and a variety of topics that I think just don't sometimes always get time in the exam room. This is one of those types of topics which, maybe if we're coming for well child visits, right, we get a little bit of, kind of parent-child relationship talk, but a lot of that might just be also developmental milestones and vaccines and this and that. So some of the medical stuff. So this, I think I'll really focus a little bit more on the social parts of the relationship and emotional parts of the relationship. It's not as much of a kind of talk about the actual, health side of things as much. So I think that's, again, that information is readily available. I feel like this is probably a little bit more pertinent to what I wanted to get across. So anyway, I always have this disclaimer for anyone watching this here in the future. This is definitely for general information purposes, and a lot of things here are kind of a mix of, again, lots of people's opinions and then sort of my interpretation of that. So that's what I'm trying to deliver here. Again, this parenting is a very highly emotional topic, and just to be clear, these are kind of my personal opinions and views. And yes, I am a family doc, and I have kids myself, but I have no other conflicts of interest. So, with any products here, financial conflicts of interest. Objectives. So, just a few things I would like to get across in this talk. A little bit about just the neurobiology and human development of, again, early human brains all the way through kind of adolescence, early adulthood, and then through even later adulthood. So just talking about how that's pertinent to how we should treat each other. And especially depending on that person's age, that does make a difference, right? They have a different brain. Very different brain, let's say, not just with what, basically the brains are just not as capable, right? They're not as developed early on. So we'll talk about that. I really like this concept of defining job roles. This is an important part of really a lot of things we do in life. I think our brain and the way that we operate is really more maximized if we have clear objectives. If we don't have those clear objectives and sort of roles, sometimes we really feel a little bit lost. It can feel scary. We don't really feel maybe safe. So having a role to kind of step into, I think, is a really important part of the human experience. And I don't know that we get that when we're given a child in any way. So we'll try to define that. And again, this is a lot of work from Dr. Becky Kennedy, who has really done this kind of work on a larger scale. Perspectives just on rewards and punishment. Again, this is kind of a common theme in taking care of especially young children here, but even kind of what that looks like as we get older and develop into older children, or what we call adults. So we will explore some concepts here. And then just talking about how much the world is always changing, but in some maybe more unique ways with how we communicate with each other in the modern world, especially compared to perhaps, even 20, 30 years ago. So just how do we make sense of some of that, and what are some important parts of that parent-child relationship that maybe can be talked about in that way? Okay. So again, early on, I think there's a few concepts that I think just to lay the groundwork for some of the tools we'll talk about, and to make those things really make sense and have some sort of scientific biologic basis. That's sort of my goal. So here we'll just talk about what is it that is unique about the human brain and human development. And I think there's a few things that we're born very helpless. right? So meaning, again, a baby is born much earlier in development in humans than compared to a lot of other mammals, whereas many of our four-legged mammals will sort of be born walking, for example, shortly after birth. We take about a year to develop the ability to walk. So, and part of that is we're upright and we have smaller pelvis, and the baby has to be developed or delivered earlier. That's sort of the main theory around why that's happened. And but one of the things that we do have is this enormous brain compared to a lot of mammals. So what that means is that, you know, again, even babies have a lot more kind of social emotional awareness even at a young age. And so that's kind of what I mean by asymmetric brain development here, that a lot of the, you know, let's say kind of higher order prefrontal cortex parts of the brain that mature all the way through about 25 years of age really control those nose circuits to kind of our instincts. But early on in development, we're really kind of looking at the people around us. We're very dependent on them because we're helpless. And the brain is, you know, again, developed in that way for survival to really play off of emotional cues from the caregivers. So usually this is obviously the parents, but if that's not the case, whoever that adult caregiver is that's providing care for that child, right, is who that is going to be. You're going to form these attachments, right? So this is somewhat of a little bit from attachment theory, right? That again, we form sort of these early relationships really based again on emotional and kind of social cues, not necessarily anything that's logical, kind of to say in direct contrast here. The quote logical parts of the brain, that left side of the brain, that prefrontal cortex part of the brain, the executive, you know, decision maker, complex thinker, again, is developed so much later and kind of asymmetrically, right? The right brain and left brain can develop at different times, at different speeds, let's say. And it is, of course, all a connected system and all works together. But again, I think it's just important to realize that, especially in early childhood, those emotional cues are a really important part of their lives. So yes, we are here. Stay in the call. So, hello. So this gets to right into kind of these critical learning windows. Hello. Hi, guys. Hi. My family just walked in. So, so yeah, and critical learning windows basically getting at this concept that as the brain is developing in this way, the brain is really cued to learn certain things at certain times of life. And it's not to say that we can't learn these things later in life, but just to say that it's a much easier to learn certain things early in life, let's say, than later in life. For example, I think many of us who have given the effort to learn another language later in life may notice that this is, again, much harder to do when you're older, whereas, you know, people who are raised bilingually or even multiple languages in their household from a young age really have an easy time maintaining that language throughout their lifetime, even if they don't practice it very much. So this is true for a lot of other emotional cues and lots of really social learning as well we're finding in the brain. And then some theories around attachment thing and the way we form relationships with other people is really thought to be solidified in this period too. So again, just kind of emphasizing that early childhood and the kind of emotional bonds and social bonds with young children and their caregivers. So again, this talk isn't necessarily going to focus a lot on some of the basic health needs, but of course that's really super important topic, and I think hopefully a lot of our material does cover some of those types of things. But again, I don't want to underemphasize or not mention just the importance of good nutrition, the importance of just allowing, exploring movement, being outdoors, getting natural light, having healthy sleep patterns for the age appropriate kind of child and adult, And again, all of these basic things that we talk about as the pillars of health apply to, of course, that parent-child relationship. I would say if those things aren't happening and a child is not, quote, behaving or sort of performing in the ways that maybe we expect as a parent, then we have to address those things first. So that is, of course, the base of that pyramid. A lot of what we're going to focus on is really assuming that some of that is being, or really a lot of that is being done, or at least effort is being given there. And of course, again, I understand that lots of people are in all sorts of different walks of life and different situations, but at least some shelter, sleep, nutrition, some basic things, not being too cold, too hot all the time, etc., have to be addressed if we're really looking for completely optimal, let's say, again, relationships and behavior. So importance of play. This is just a really important part of mammalian behavior, and really all mammals play, especially in childhood. This is how we explore the world in so many different ways. This can look like team sports. This can look like just wrestling. This can look like all sorts of different things. This can look like, formal games, lots of informal games, pretend play, all sorts of stuff, just depending on the age. But having play really throughout our lives, more than just in childhood, but especially in childhood, is very important for developing healthy relationships, learning how to navigate, issues, resolve conflict. So many different things happen during play that are important and translate into the real world in so many meaningful ways. And if we have a lack of play, I think we see a lot of, there's a lot of literature out there about how perhaps the lack of play in our children today might be leading to some of these spikes in, let's say, mental health problems we're seeing, all the way up to, again, this is a deadly disease with people taking their lives for these reasons too. Again, that important part of really play throughout not childhood, but throughout lifetime. Full spectrum of emotion. What I'm getting at here is really that children may experience, the full array of emotions, but they don't have all the skills, right, as an adult to kind of deal with it. And so that is really just explains a lot, I think, about how children behave, right? That we forget that perhaps their internal landscape is just as complex as ours, but they don't have words half the time. They really don't have that fully developed brain with the, again, prefrontal cortex part of the brain that's able to feed back and say, hey, this is not necessarily a situation I need to cry and scream and throw everything in the room about. Again, but they have these really strong emotions and complex emotions, and we'll talk a lot about how we can help to regulate those things and to try to be a model. Nonverbal expression. So again, this is super important, not just in early childhood, but really, again, throughout lifetime. Using this as a tool, even as a parent, is one of the things we'll talk about. Nonverbal cues here. This is a really powerful tool. You don't always have to use words. Silence can be really powerful, especially expressions or other kind of things that facial expressions. Our face is very attuned to express, emotion, and that's very interesting topic and has a lot of cultural ties. But again, that is the way even our baby brains are looking at parents' faces to really try to read emotions, and that's the way we're sort of built, I would say. So respecting that and understanding that that's a powerful tool, I think, is an important part of what we'll talk about. And then kind of tie it into what I was just talking about a little bit too, that depending on where you're raised, what cultural background your parents are from, what country you were born in, etc., these things do change a lot about several aspects of life, and certainly parent-child relationships. I think I try to focus on things that I really think hopefully apply through throughout multiple cultures, but I realize that that's, sometimes impossible. And of course, there's things that, even from myself, from, having been raised sort of dual culture, I can't fully understand. So here, just trying to respect that I do my best here, but there are differences that sometimes I can't understand either. So, and perhaps not everything I say is perfect for every culture. So, emotional health, right? So just some key concepts of, emotional health. I think this applies to, again, all humans. And this is, again, tailored towards parent-child behavior, but again, important through all, I think perhaps all relationships. So especially early in life, I think that, one of the parents' jobs or roles, or one of the things a kid is looking for, is being able to process their emotion in a safe space. So that's what I'm kind of talking about here. And a lot of people talk about that it's not the, let's say this ties a little bit into trauma, right? Am I traumatizing my kid? Is this going to traumatize, that going to traumatize? It's not necessarily the event, the kind of reaction and, ability and space to process that. There's some, theories around that, perhaps, again, not being able to kind of connect, being able, just having, and then sort of having an error in who's assigned responsibility here, right, is sort of part of what happens with trauma. So it's not necessarily all the event, right? An event can be a trigger, but then you have to have this lack of emotional connection, and then sort of also confusion around responsibility. These seem to be the big themes around trauma. And so when we have an event, if we, as a parent or caregiver, connect with that child and give sort of a space and, allow them to process whatever emotions they're feeling. And certainly if the case is that none of that was their responsibility, sort of making that very clear that they have no need to have, that again, there's no sort of, again, we're tying into combating shame, really, right? So that's what I'm getting at here, is allowing them to process that emotion, not feel shame around it, not feel alone in that. So that's what I'm getting at is here, as far as emotional processing. Um, the driver, pilot versus passenger, right? So this is, again, kind of just how do we handle our emotions? What do they mean? Are they kind of the ultimate truth? And this, I think, again, emotions are real. You are feeling what you're feeling. Trying to understand what you're feeling is information. But, as a mature adult, thinking about, should those emotions be the driver or pilot of your plane, or should they be the passenger, right? Or and we have this kind of sense of higher self that we can think about, and that could maybe feed back and say, no, these emotions are there, they're information, right? But I'm not going to let them make the decision. And so that's really the concept we're getting at here. The reference that I'll use a lot today in today's talk is from Dr. Becky Kennedy, and she talks a lot about this concept of, hey, again, if people are upset and flared up on a plane because, let's say because of the weather, the pilot says we need to turn around. And then everyone on the plane, or even just a few people on the plane, throw a tantrum and say, oh, no, I need to get where I'm going, and I'm so angry, right? And so the pilot says, oh, okay, fine, we'll just fly through this weather, right? I mean, that doesn't necessarily sound like a good way to make, smart decisions. So that's the kind of concept we're getting at here, right? Is that, sure, we want to take into account how people feel, maybe validate their emotions or validate that you're feeling something yourself, right? But do we want to then allow that to be really the driver or decision maker of our, life? So then this ties right into acknowledging that kind of inner voice, and that we do have, sort of desires and emotions and feelings, and ignoring those things often doesn't lead to better outcomes. So trying to tap into really understanding what you feel, why you feel, where it comes from. Again, here, I think this is sometimes a difficult task for people to do on their own. And of course, there are many professionals that can help you with this kind of work of all sorts of different styles and varieties. But just acknowledging that we have this inner life, and that's a really important part of who we are, and what we're going to become and what we're going to do with ourselves. And I think those things are very tied together. Not respecting this, I think I personally I've seen lead to a lot of you know regret and just poor outcomes. Let's say a lot of negative kind of things in life. Balancing our values, right? This is just understanding what our values are. Maybe to start, just saying what is it that we really do value, and what are the, if we have a priority list, what are those kind of family values, right? This is not just perhaps self, but again, in that family setting, what are those family values? Whether that's, time together, honesty, this, that, all sorts of different things, we need to celebrate certain cultural, holidays, or again, and then thinking about how do I, balance all those things to really have something like balance and have time for wellness and self-care. Again, you have to have enough time to do all of those things. So understanding where and how much time those things take, and again, just being honest with ourselves, I think. Fostering independence and creativity. Again, I think this is what we all want an opportunity to do in our lives, right? If we think about what do we want in our jobs and careers and maybe other aspects like that, I think most of, I won't speak for everybody, but I think myself and a lot of people that I've ran into and talked to about this issue would say that yes, we want, to have a little bit of space to have some autonomy and independence, some space for maybe creativity. It's very hard to be in a workplace, let's say, where none of your ideas are ever listened to or welcomed, where you're really not allowed to express yourself in any sort of way. Those are very often difficult places to be for long periods of time. So we all, I think, as human beings, have a drive to want to express ourselves in some sort of way. And this doesn't have to be huge things all the time, but just it can be even small things. So just fostering space for that, I think, in that parent-child relationship and within the family, I think, is a really important aspect of health and emotional health. So we'll jump into these job roles. So this is, again, kind of from Dr. Becky Candy's work, and she has a book, a website, a whole kind of service called Good Inside, a TED Talk, podcast that, with Andrew Huberman, all sorts of different platforms that you can kind of get this information and do a little deeper dive on these concepts that I'm trying to get at here. So really, for adults, I think it's nice to just have that parent job role, right? Have a description of what is it that I'm supposed to do to really help raise a healthy child. And again, not focusing on those basic health needs. We got to fulfill those. This is more that emotional health side, right? But building boundaries and kind of validation and empathy, those are kind of the main two, really, and they tie right together to each other, I think, right? And she specifies, again, boundaries are not requests. So some concrete examples here will be, again, stop jumping on the bed. That's not necessarily a boundary, that's a request, because let's say you have a young child, and, something like a boundary might be, hey, I've asked you to stop jumping on the bed. If you don't stop jumping on the bed, I will have to come and remove you from the bed. So whatever's appropriate for that situation, right? But a boundary she defines as not the other party not having to do something, right? It's something that you do to set a limit, not that something someone else has to do in order to follow that limit. And so again, thinking about what that looks like in different scenarios, but that's really her definition of kind of these healthy boundaries that we're going to hopefully set with really lots of people in our lives, but definitely in this setting, kind of the parent-child relationship. And then empathy and validation, this gets at all of the kind of concepts I was just talking about with emotional health, right, is really trying to connect with what your child is feeling. And, so one of her big lines is, I believe you, right? So just believing their emotional experience, right? That, yes, you're upset. And instead of jumping to, all the reasons they shouldn't be upset. Well, it's just, you had 15 cookies today and it's just one more, or whatever, that didn't matter anyway, or next time you'll get whatever you wanted. So, the things we try to jump to, I think first, what we're seeing in a lot of this, work and evidence is that if we just connect first, then that's really what children are looking for. This will tie into kind of these concepts of feeling safe and feeling real, right? So the way a child brain seems to work is really that they're always looking for validation outside of themselves. They have a sense of that everything is almost their fault as their default, right? So this is really getting at allowing them to let go of those kinds of concepts, and understanding that no, like, this caregiver is connecting with me and is, can understand what I feel, gives me space to kind of process that, and validates my experience. But no, I can't necessarily do anything I want all the time, right? And just cry to get my way, and whatever influence, again, become the driver. Let the emotions become the driver of those decisions, right? And that's where those boundaries come in, is trying to, again, not allow those emotions to become the pilot, right? You as the adult really should be a sturdy leader, right, is the other big role here. And I like that word sturdiness that she uses. It's a little bit different than resiliency, right? And it's just having the, kind of wherewithal to withstand that emotional maybe barrage, and then again, to become kind of that leader and decision maker of the process, not those emotions, or not maybe the emotions of your child. So what is a child's role, right? So we'll give them some roles too. So again, I think engaging in play, right, is a big role that of a child, right? They are supposed to play, right, and play in the real world, play with other kids, play with people of a variety of different ages, right? I think sometimes we only think about kids interacting with other kids, and here I'll emphasize that again, kids really do need interaction with, let's say, kids of variety of ages, and really adults, maybe a variety of ages as well. It's really important. It seems to be a really formative kind of way that we develop much more complex social connections and see much better emotional and social health as we age, if we have this earlier in life. And again, worldwide, we see that this is so much more common. In America, we see kind of this concept of the nuclear family, and really worldwide, that's not necessarily been the case, and really historically hasn't been the case for human beings. We lived in much more multi-generational tribes, and then, let's say, again, homes later as we sort of modernized. It's much more common to have maybe 3 or 4 generations under one roof, and for grandparents and even great-grandparents to be an important part, let's say, of even early child rearing and other kind of important early child lifetime events. And so just realizing that that is sort of the way of many humans for many, many centuries and thousands of years really developed. And then sort of right now we have much more, let's say, smaller family units, and just less default interaction with a lot more of the adult figures. So that's a big part of, I think, why we want to interact in a lot of different ways, and not just play with other children, but really we'll talk about doing things that are kind of adult tasks as well. And then the other big role is, again, that creative expression, right? Just having that space to really express their different interests. And this isn't always, let's say, again, one specific thing. This might be, art, but it might be birds or reading or math or some other really kind of topic or passion that the child shows, right? So just respecting that and trying to understand their natural drives and what, kind of their interests are. This again doesn't mean that we have to, always take down all those boundaries to make that happen all the time, but we also have to have that balance of allowing them to have that space to express that as well. Okay. So talk a little bit about rewards, punishments, and kind of the motivations behind these things, and maybe the motivations behind just child's behavior and maybe human behavior overall. So I'll start with this concept that I think is just so valuable and really meaningful to me personally, and just makes a lot of sense as a place to start, right? Is that I think we're all, and especially children, right, are sort of born good inside. If we can't really start there, then it feels sort of, I don't know, like, I don't know. I just feel strongly that that's a really good place to start. You have to start with these good intentions. If you want to build a good world and have a good relationship, then we have to sort of assume that there's goodness in us and that we're good inside and that our children are good inside and want to be good. I think, again, that's just a really important concept and mindset. I would say this is, again, the name of Dr. Becky Kennedy's whole concept and, book, podcast, etc. But I just find it really, really valuable kind of philosophy and concept, and drives a lot of, I think, what I've said today, and we'll talk about as we go forward. So this kind of ties again into these concepts that, again, children really do, I think, want to contribute to the family and society, especially, again, as they get older, right? We talked a little bit about babies are definitely kind of helpless and can't do much, and it takes a little while, let's say at least till probably, but even as early as, let's say, 1, 2, as we see kids kind of develop the ability to walk, in the book Gather Parent, they talk a lot about in these other cultures, right? They have these children do small tasks, even bring a little thing to the parent or whatever, and that this is important, right? Just to contribute to this internal drive that I think we have as humans, wanting to kind of contribute to something that's bigger than us. And as we age, maybe that circle gets a little bigger and bigger, but as we're maybe small kids, that looks like just our family unit, or our extended family unit, or that multi-generational home, or that little village or tribe or whatever. Again, you can see how this may grow over time. I do believe that we all have sort of this natural drive, and that's something that's even present in children. If we respect that, right, then we don't necessarily have to always think about reward and punishment, right? So dressing ourselves or setting the table or these household chores, if we can build kind of a family story around how this is contributing to the whole family unit and the wellness of the family, and again, even leads to, let's say, allows us to then play and have fun and do the things that maybe are more that the child maybe wants to do all the time, right? But again, I think this is a much healthier concept than sort of ruling by fear, right? That everything always has to be done just because I say it, right? And look, sometimes do we need our children to just listen to us and, kind of do what we say, especially, let's say, younger children, especially when it relates to safety, their direct kind of say, don't run into the street, don't hit other whatever children. And again, we can explain later on why these things are important, right? But sometimes we do have to build those strong boundaries, especially when it's around safety. The other, I guess, thing I really should put into the concept of boundaries is that, one of the biggest boundaries is going to be around safety, health and safety, right? So those are some really hard boundaries that we should set around those types of things, right? That my job is really to keep you safe. It's not necessarily to keep you happy all the time, right? It's really to keep you safe, and then to validate those feelings and to even say that frustration is okay, right? I think that's an important concept of what we'll talk about in one of the slides as well. So the other thing I'd also mentioned already was just that feeling real and feeling safe, right? I think kids really want those two things. They, again, if they feel unsafe, then we can get all sorts of different behaviors as a result. So that can look like yelling and screaming and tantrums. That can look like complete withdrawal, right, from all relationships, and just, again, not engaging in play, not engaging in these other healthy behaviors. Those can all be signs, right, of not feeling safe. And then this feeling real, right, really is in this emotional landscape that, again, we have all these complex feelings. We're trying to develop this sense of self and this sense of kind of emotional regulation, right? This, again, kind of self that can regulate these emotions and finally make a decision. So if we never even acknowledge that those emotions are real or happening within us, again, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense of how then we can develop this kind of decision maker and logical control, right, and become these rational, kind of more productive adults. So again, I think just acknowledging that those emotions are real, right? Starting for that, in childhood, doing that for your child as sort of their mentor, their leader, their sturdy leader, I think is really an important tool that you're handing them that will really help them, not just in childhood with, again, the tantrums and everything else, but really as adults, right? And build really mature, creative, productive adults, right? Which is what I think the goal is, hopefully, for most parents, is just that they want to see their children do as much as they can in the world. And I think a huge part of that is, again, that mental landscape, being able to even envision what that looks like, right? And if we're always bogged down by, some of these emotional states, then I can say, at least personally, that definitely makes a difference. So here, safety boundaries, right? So again, kind of just had jumped forward and talked about this already, that safety is a really important issue. But here I'll also hit on a little bit of this concept of too much safety, actually. So Jonathan Haidt in The Anxious Generation talks a little bit about this, right, of this safetyism kind of concept. But yes, if their life is in danger, right, they're going to get whatever, hit by a car, drown, or these types of things, we have to intervene. But in situations where maybe minor injury could happen, or let's say just conflict between children, I think there's a lot of parts of our culture that step in and intervene too much, don't allow children to resolve their own conflicts. There's a lot of, let's say, playgrounds that have been just made way too safe, right? Everything is just completely fall proof and nothing. Again, play is so important, right? We tied into this concept of how play is so important. And this sort of is why we would say there has to be enough risk within that play for us to actually develop. We talk about, in sort of the learning landscape, there's evidence that, about a 15% failure rate is what's sort of optimal for best learning, right? Just getting at that frustration and failure and risk are actually necessary parts of growth, right? That if we don't push the brain and neural system kind of outside of its, kind of comfort zones, then we don't have growth. We don't get that neuroplasticity, adaptive changes, right? We have to be adapting to something. So again, just thinking about kind of keeping those concepts in this balance of safety, right, and building those boundaries in that way, I think is what I'm getting at here. So again, this is a very nuanced conversation and very, I guess, again, hopefully you understand what I'm getting at here. Again, allowing your child to just take some risks, right, and to have some failure and to sit in frustration, that we don't have to build boundaries so narrowed, right, that never happens in life. I think that's a really important concept. So praise versus acknowledgement, right? Again, this goes into kind of this concepts of reward and punishment, especially to the kind of rewards and praise, right? So I think what we're seeing is that maybe limiting praise, right? If we're praising every little thing, then it really takes some of the, you know, kind of strength away from that praise, right? So we can acknowledge that, we're fulfilling a family role. But so small examples here would be like, great job, thank you for great job setting the table, right? If that's the family job, that you set the table every day, or whatever that chore is, right? Or you picked up whatever, a fork that fell on the ground, or just little things like this throughout daily life that hopefully can just become sort of a normal thing. If we start to praise these little types of things, then when we praise something that's really worth praise, it seems that effect, basically, it doesn't stick anymore, right? They've heard it so many times that it doesn't really have an effect in their brain anymore. So I think withholding those kind of praise things, you can acknowledge, right? That I see that you did your chore, right? Just acknowledging that they completed their task, right, is another way to kind of spin that, and to still sort of give that acknowledgement, and validate that, yes, I see that you're fulfilling, these expectations, or wherever that family role is. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here, that difference. And again, I think just building this family story and these roles, right, and dynamic, where we're not motivating always through, okay, well, if you set the table, then you'll get extra TV time or dessert or these other kind of treats, right? Then we sort of get into this, what I'll tie into later, right? This almost even like dopamine addiction cycle, right? This is literally kind of in that reward cycle of their brain, right? And this is a kind of dangerous place to really seed our motivations, right? We really want to come from different neural circuits from the, again, build that prefrontal cortex of the brain, and come from these neural circuits that are much more tied to that executive function, right? Doing things out of autonomy and independence and creativity, right, are going to be much more lifelong, fulfilling kind of motivations, rather than, always working from this kind of place of fear or reward-based, behavior. And so why would we wait until adulthood, right, to start this kind of relationship with maybe the most important people in our lives as a parent, right, our children, right, or even if we're not a parent, right, just again, if you're in that caregiver role, that means usually that you deeply care for this other person, right? So if that's the case, we're assuming that there's some level or high level of love there. Again, would we not want that for our loved one, or our, in our workplace as our boss, right? Would we always want that, okay, we're going to get the stick all the time, right? Or we would want a boss that's sort of saying, hey, again, I think we all want to work out of a sense of pride, not a sense of obligation, right? Or let's say, again, we work best and people perform the best and kind of do their best work when they're doing something, again, not because just someone told them to. Maybe someone did tell them to also, right? But they also have some sort of inner drive and voice and kind of passion and or pride around it, right? So that's what I'm getting at here, is trying to build that rather than focusing on reward and punishment, is really what I've seen throughout the literature. And a lot of people that I, again, will reference to here seem to get at this concept as a much healthier way to build healthy adults and healthy relationships throughout your life. So this team acronym, so this was, again, this togetherness, right? And then this autonomy, I'm even forgetting the acronym myself, but this was from Hunt Gather Parent, basically. But there's a really nice acronym that, again, you can look up here, and it's a lot of the concepts I'm basically talking about here, which is togetherness, right? Emotional regulation, autonomy, and then minimal interference. I guess that's actually what it is. So again, a lot of what I've talked about here, but some of the evidence behind those things, hopefully I've illustrated here. That concept of too much safety gets at that minimal interference. Autonomy, we've talked a lot about that today. Again, emotional regulation, right? Being that adult, right? Not throwing the adult tantrum, being the role model that can show a child, what emotional regulation looks like. Again, this is very complex, and a lot of us have to sort of do a lot of self-healing, I think, to be able to do these things. And we're going to fail a bunch of times, right? And I've already said that we're supposed to fail if we want to learn. And I will say that, again, I'm certainly not anywhere near perfect at any of this. So knowing is not necessarily always enough, right? And understanding even deeply is not necessarily always enough. So this is practice, and again, ties a lot into repair here, right? That we're gonna fail, and acknowledging that frustration and failure is going to happen, I think, is a really important part of life and emotional health, like acceptance. But then doing something, right, to connect and repair. Hey, I'm sorry, I yelled. I'm working on my emotions too, just like you. Something like that, right? A real kind of connection there. That's, again, what Becky Kennedy kind of defines as real repair, right? Not necessarily doing I'm sorry, but this was your fault in some way. Usually is the next statement, or this wouldn't happen because if you hadn't, et cetera, et cetera. And again, that's not saying that we're not going to fix a problem, right? So an example here, I wouldn't have yelled if you had just put your shoes on, then we could have gotten out the door. We can still say, I shouldn't have yelled. It's never your fault when I yell. How do you think we could get out the door faster tomorrow? Right? So we don't have to sort of concede that we're not going to fix the problem. And then we also want to sort of separate the behavior from the person, right? So this ties back to this good inside concept, right? That if we all kind of assume we're good inside, that the child is good inside, then we can come from a place of, hey, you're a good kid having a hard time. You're a good kid going through a hard emotion, right? I'm a good parent going through a hard time. I'm a good parent going through a hard emotion, right? And this is one of those mantras that, again, from Dr. Kennedy, that, again, can help us really get to these places of repair and connection, right? And coming back to validating, right? One of our big roles, right? I believe you. You were really upset that we couldn't go on this play date, and sometimes we really just have to do things that are hard, right? And I know, and then sort of the other tool she talks about, right, is giving them that space to grow into, more, right? So then saying, I know you can get through this, right? Or I know you can say that in a different way, or whatever the situation may call for, right? But as a parent, if we kind of almost give them that expectation that we know they can be better, right, then kids are going to want to step into that, right, rather than kind of talking about reward and punishment. Again, we give them that motivation to step into these natural drives to want to contribute, to want to be good inside, really. So just building that space, I think, for children, right, rather than sort of jumping right to these rewards and punishments. So again, super hard to do, takes a lot of practice, but if we don't even kind of know about these concepts or try, right, then we'll never make any progress. So
He was encouraging.
encouragement.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lifelong relationships. So this is just getting at that, we focused a lot on early development just because, again, that's a super important part of life. We talked about those critical learning windows and why that's so. Again, but this can and does change throughout a lifetime, and you can repair things that, again, even happened many years ago. So let's not, I'm not trying to say that this is a one-way street. I'm just sort of emphasizing some early childhood kind of, setting us up for success. But again, these relationships hopefully will last, a lifetime for at least, one, until one of the parties perishes. Um, and, just what does that look like, right, over a lifetime? We've talked a lot about this first concept, right, of really encouraging frustration and learning, right? I think, again, this allows us to, so one of the things that I think a lot of maybe parents, especially today, may worry about is sort of this concept of entitlement. And one of the ways I've heard this explained, and Dr. Becky Kennedy talks about entitlement, right, is sort of the inability to deal with frustration, right? And if we sort of never can sit in this feeling of frustration, we have a huge fear reaction and just go kind of, into fight or flight mode anytime we feel any sense of frustration. That's, I think, a nice picture of what entitlement really looks like. And so then if that's really the problem there, then I would say that practicing being frustrated is actually kind of an important concept, just accepting that frustration is a part of life. So what does this kind of look like early on? This might look like taking your child to a talk or the grocery store, or again, just these kind of adult tasks, right? We have to live our lives as adults, and we actually want to role model what that looks like to the child. We don't want the child, kind of always doing only child-centric things and never allowing the child to sort of, quote, be bored or frustrated, right? I think is maybe really setting us up for then an adult who also never can deal with frustration or really solve problems in a creative way. And again, this is an important concept, how we all learn too. And so just maximizing that and realizing that, yes, this really looks like so many, kind of plays out in other parts of our lives in really health promoting, career promoting, lots of other relationship promoting ways. So really just can flourish in lots of other ways as a, person if we kind of learn this concept early. So this is, again, kind of that involved in daily tasks, right? So this is how then we build these interests with our kids, and maybe we do things that they like too, right? And as we age as parents, we can become more involved in their tasks and try to realize what their, interests and passions are. So this kind of goes both ways, right? Early in life, we want the child to maybe do adult tasks so that we can teach them adult tasks. And then later in life, we may become more involved with their kind of tasks, right? So that, again, just building that connection, right, and respecting that other person's autonomy and independence. Building trust and confidence, right? So trust, I think, again, has to be built on that you believe that other person's experience, right? And I think that's a very, kind of minimum needed, right? That they're going to tell you what's their, internal, again, feelings and emotions and trust, right, are things you can't just you can't do a blood test. I can't, scan you and kind of know, right? So there has to be this expression, right, this matching of internal and external kind of environments, right? So if we say we're going to do something and then we don't do that, right, then it's very hard to trust. So what I'm getting at is sort of, we have to have that belief in the other person's emotional state, right? And so you can see why, again, this ties into this validation kind of role as parents, right? If we never validate, right, if the child is always taught that, someone else kind of knows my feelings better than me, right? When they're told, well, no, you shouldn't feel that way, or don't worry about this, or whatever, and you never validate the feelings, and the internal dialogue sort of turns into this, again, other people know my internal state better than I do, right? And I think that can really decay trust or sort of cloud the picture of trust. And then this confidence, concept, right, of that's really, I think, what confidence is, right, is that internal belief, right, that I believe my own internal emotional state, right, and internal kind of information that I'm receiving from my mind and body to be true. That's sort of what allows confidence, right? If we're constantly second guessing our internal states and we're in this kind of story of the outside world can tell me how I feel better than I can, then I don't see how we can have real confidence, right? Confidence really comes from that matching, that yes, what I feel is real. I'm allowed to express that, right, is maybe the second part of that, right? But if you can't even understand that internal state, then, or if you have a lot of doubt in that internal state, I would say that's the exact opposite of confidence. So that's what I'm getting at here is, if those are the concepts, how do we build that over a lifetime, right? Again, then you see why empathy and validation and the expression and communication, right, become such important parts of this relationship. Mentoring by example, I think I've said this one a bunch. So again, it's a really hard job. It's the most important job in the world. um, so, and there's not always a lot of help out there, at least from like just societal kind of the way our workplaces and kind of pressures are set up. I do see that perhaps we're not the most parent friendly here compared to maybe some other places in the world. That being said, again, we just have to kind of find those resources. There's so many more things today, I think, than there ever was, right? So Good Inside, so many different books out there. And again, I share my resources, but there's so many others out there, right? And so many people trying to do good work here and make some changes to allow, parents to have that time and emotional space to make those connections with their children. So I'll make a big plug here for things like, maternity and paternity leave, on a bigger scale, I think are just, essential parts of allowing these relationships to solidify and to start on a good foot. So I hope that that's something that will come in this country's future. So make a plug for that for anyone that's listening. So respect and autonomy, I think, again, we've hit on this a bunch, right? That they're another person, that, they're good inside, that they have inner passions and desires. And again, that we don't have to bend all our boundaries just to meet all of those kinds of needs, but just even respecting that they're there and allowing some space, for safe autonomy and expression. I think a lot of times we as parents think we have to sort of tell our children what to do and sort of guide them very strongly. And that doesn't really always turn out the way we think it will as parents. And, I think, again, respecting some of these basic human concepts and thinking, again, what would I want out of my boss or leader? Are maybe better ways to think about that than sort of just I say you do kind of concept of parent-child relationship. So, and then time, right? How does any of this time happen if we don't spend time with our children, throughout their lifetime, right? So just making sure that that's a priority and that, again, whichever side whichever party is listening, right, just trying to make that connection, right, I think is really important. So you have to allow for time to allow any of this to happen. So some of the modern world troubles here. Again, pulling a little bit from kind of Dopamine Nation, right? What a lot of these social media tools and even our TV ads and the modern food environment, really a lot of the kind of modern, um, let's say even capitalistic environment in a lot of ways is really built around this dopamine drive of the brain, right? So this kind of quote unquote reward pathway and kind of scarcity loop or other kind of scarcity loop is a book by Michael Easter that talks about this kind of neural circuit as well, right? So just understanding that this is not a willpower issue, that this isn't like choices that people are necessarily making. When we get into certain networks of the brain and these dopamine drives, these are really kind of basic, almost become involuntary, right? That we're working with really ancient, powerful brain drives that are intended to kind of keep us alive. So one of the examples I'll show here is that when we knock out certain circuits like this in mice, these dopamine circuits, right, that they will not even eat food in front of them, and they will starve and die and just sit in they lose the motivation to even eat, is how important these dopamine drives are in our brain, right? So when we knock them out in an experiment in a mouse, what I'm getting at is they won't even eat. They will eventually eat if you put the food in their mouth, but they don't have the dopamine drive to actually seek food, right? So that motivation, that motivated behavior is a lot of that dopamine. So what I'm saying is that when you play with things like this, when you get on social media and then you can't get off for 2 hours, that's because your brain is sort of built that way, and these products are built to prey on those circuits. And that's not necessarily a choice you're always making. That's in those higher kind of order parts of the brain where we put kind of executive thinking and choice, right? What the part that's becoming the decision maker is sort of these more ancient, brain circuits that were intended to help you find food and help you survive. So that's really what I'm getting at here with dopamine and addiction. And, again, with internet, social media, a lot of our modern kind of comforts, we've found that, again, we've pushed way too far to that pleasure side, and we don't have enough of that frustration and pain and sort of, built-in kind of difficulty to things. And then we get that dopamine hit way too fast with social media, right? So that's part of the problem, is you can reproduce kind of this dopamine circuit very quickly, go to the next post, all you have to do is kind of move your thumb, right, or swipe in a direction, and you're getting more of this kind of reward into your brain. So just realizing that this is happening, right, is sort of my point of saying all this, right? So again, Dopamine Nation, really great book to learn more about this in different ways. So our kids have to deal with all this just like we do, right? And they don't even have the mature brain to sort of even feed back and say no to this stuff, right? So, and again, Anxious Generation talks a lot about this too, how these modern tools of communication are wonderful in so many ways and allow really interesting connections and great things to happen, right? But some of the dark side of these things, especially in children, is preying on these brain circuits, not allowing for real development, right? Emotional processing, there's no space to process emotions anymore. People are just reacting, right? We don't get facial expressions. So again, I talked a lot about nonverbal cues earlier, how important that is, especially early in childhood, but really in all relationships. So many things here that are blocked, right? Experience blocked, right, in this format. So again, I'm not saying here, destroy Facebook and Instagram and everything, right? But I am going to say that setting hard limits on this, early in life, I really think is a very smart policy. Again, there's a lot of evidence that Jonathan Haidt talks about in his book. We can't set limits on ourselves, is what I'm trying to say with that first part, right? Is that if we're working with these kind of brain circuits, what we have to then sort of plan for, right, is maybe a hard limit here. And some of those hard limits early on in life may be none, right? No social media, no smartphone, right, I think are kind of important policies. And he talks about even till 16, right? So till a pretty late age, till we develop really a lot of social skills, a lot of real world kind of emotional regulation, other parts of our brain, right? So that then we don't end up with this high risk of basically, depression, anxiety, and even suicidality, right? So that's really what's at stake. It really is a lifetime of well-being we're talking about. The title of the slide, this was again for well-being, parent-child relationships for well-being, and again emphasize on a lifetime, right? As a family medicine doctor and someone who's very focused on a lifetime of well-being, we have to sort of set ourselves up for success here, and this is something we can control, right? So I realize that it's very normal nowadays to, for young kids to have, a lot of different forms of technology. And again, we're guilty too, and, do have, tablets and other things that our kids get, but at very select moments. And, just realizing, again, having those hard limits, realizing what this can do, realizing what it does to behavior, even in an adult, right, I think is just so important, right? And just, being mindful, let's say, of all of this more than anything. I think this ties a lot into this kind of modern crisis of loneliness too, right? Is that we don't have this real full emotional connection when we don't see a face and expression and have that sort of conflict resolution, right? We're in the same space for a long time to deal with this person that I'm angry with because they're in my house or in my little village or whatever. I can't just whatever. And I think that's tied into maybe why there's this loneliness crisis, right? Is that we're just we didn't build these skills, right? We didn't have those moments. We didn't have all those frustrations, all these complex emotional ties. Maybe early in childhood we just had a lot of whatever, Facebook friendships, etc. Maybe we're not involved in team sports. We're not involved in, again, any other aspects where we have complex social dynamics. I could see very easily then why that would lead to a brain that might really be at high risk for always feeling lonely, right? Because we were never taught that deep emotional connection and given those opportunities. So brain maturity, right? So I talked a lot about this, right? That the circuits that can help us modulate these behaviors don't even develop until later in life. And so we really have to respect that too, right? That even as a 16 or 20-year-old, we still have a lot of development in that prefrontal cortex, kind of ultimate decision maker of the brain. And so through 25 really for many people. So trying to respect those timelines of just basic human biology and neurodevelopment that, again, if we're playing with these kind of ancient circuits that are developed from a much younger age and we don't even have the brain, right, development of the brain, you can already see how this can be a dangerous thing you're playing with. So what do we do about all of it, all of this? I think I hopefully gave some practical tools throughout the talk, but we'll focus a lot more on that now. So I think, again, for a lot of the modern things that we just talked about, I would say, again, getting out in nature, right, is a really big deal. Green spaces release endorphins. They activate the visual system in lots of unique ways and just change neural chemistry in many ways that promote well-being. The natural sunlight, the full spectrum sunlight are kind of important triggers, again, in our brain for so many different things, and screens do and don't trigger that in all sorts of different complex ways that are just not necessarily really always good for our well-being, especially if they're being used at night when we're expecting darkness, right? So then respecting darkness too, in contrast to light. But really, again, getting in sync with the fact that, again, we have a 24-hour day, there is day and night, having healthy sleep, right? A lot of this is tied into getting into nature and unplugging here. Plan frustration, right? So for all of us in our lives, just realizing that we're going to have moments that are hard and frustrating and difficult to deal with, and just separating that from an identity, and anticipating and accepting that, I think, is really an important part of emotional well-being, and really then being able to overcome those things in a graceful way, in a meaningful way, and not just sitting in those emotions. Creating community really helps with this, right? So we're really social beings. I have a whole talk on social health, right? Whatever that community is around, that can be, again, a family unit, extended family, shared interests, other adults. We talked a little bit about that, having other adult, maybe caregivers for your children in different ways, can be kind of another important part of really building that community. Leading by example, right? So not just saying what to do, but doing these things, right? We can't expect, our children to really be maximally healthy if we're not necessarily shooting for good health for ourselves, right? And acknowledging some of the basic things we have to do for ourselves. Encouraging play, talked about this a lot throughout the talk today, right? This is an essential part of human behavior and the human experience. This is not to say we have to play all the time, right? But we also want to respect that we want to try to build play into our lives in different ways. Another idea that I didn't talk about much earlier, but just trying to make maybe even mundane things into play, right? Especially for children, this can be a really effective strategy of how to kind of tie them into doing household tasks and other things of that nature, kind of make it a little bit more playful, and make some family stories around it. Not responding, right? This is a kind of a nice big tool. I say for modern living, just because everything is about like instant response, instant this, instant gratification, right? So building in a delay here is the other concept I'm talking about, right? So I think not responding is a interesting and kind of effective way to do that, right? Is just kind of giving a look and sort of walking away and giving space, right? These are kind of different ways. And then rather than kind of responding and, letting, again, those emotions drive that interaction, then we sort of acknowledge, right? But then walk away. And this can be much more effective in sort of then that other party sort of realizing, maybe I shouldn't have said that or done that or whatever, rather than sort of diving into a conflict now. And then there's mantras, right? So kind of those good inside mantras, you're good inside and going through a rough time or rough emotion. I'm good inside, I'm going through a rough time emotion, right? But some of these, whatever the situation, right? But these types of mantras, repeating these over and over again, sometimes in high emotion states, can really help you exit some of those high emotion states. So a lot of people will, again, try this, right? So if it doesn't work, you can try something else. But if you never try any of this, right, you'll never really know for yourself. So as with all my tools, I just encourage people to explore anything and everything they would find might help them, right? But if you never try something, again, it's really hard to know what's going to help you. So just a few resources here. How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen. This is a really nice book written by kind of a second generation child psychologist, real focused more on maybe the 2 to 7 age group. Good Inside, I've referenced this so many times today. Anxious Generation, Hunt Gather Parent. There's so many other resources here that I didn't list, but these were the main things that I really pulled a lot of my talk from today, along with just concepts of mindfulness, social health, emotional health, just from general, I'd say, kind of psychology and my clinical experience just as a family doc, having seen lots of kids and adults for all sorts of varieties of issues. So that's really where my information comes from, and hopefully you can get a little further reading here. Thank you guys for coming. Next talk's next month, 13th. Awesome.